top question anybody ever has when it comes to moving to Florida is about hurricanes and flood insurance. So that's exactly what we're going to cover in today's video. Before anybody usually asks me about school ratings, HOA fees, neighborhoods, the number one question they have is, or I guess their number one fear or worry is hurricanes, and then also about flood insurance. There's so much misinformation about both, really, and you can't really just group the whole state of Florida into one because we're so vastly different. And the Northeast Florida, like hurricane landscape, flood landscape is so different from, the west side of Florida, southwest part of Florida, South Florida, night and day difference. And unfortunately, when it comes to insurance, I think all of us here in Northeast Florida kind of suffer from everything down in South Florida, Southwest Florida, where they just keep getting hammered, right, for the hurricanes. So Northeast Florida overall, I will say, I think our last major hurricane was like Hurricane Dora that actually did, damage. And that was in 1960. That was the last major kind of hurricane to make landfall in the Jacksonville area. I've been here since 2014. We've been through several hurricanes. I've never had to evacuate. I haven't lived in a flood zone. I haven't felt like I needed to evacuate. I've always compared it to, I would say, like, especially if you're coming from the Northeast, is like a nor'easter. And actually, I honestly felt like the nor'easter I experienced up there was worse than what I've experienced down here. So if that puts any perspective, gives you any perspective on that. But we're going to talk about like cost, flood zones, all of those things that I know that, you're really pondering if you're thinking about making the move down here. So one thing's for sure, and that is if you're just getting your information from national news coverage, news sensationalize everything. I know living here, I have my mom lives in Arkansas, so if she sees anything on the news, she's so worried. Oh, you okay? Like, what's going on? Are you? I'm like, Mom, we are completely fine. Everything's fine. We're okay. Now I live in St. Augustine, and there's certain areas, obviously, in this area, especially like historic downtown St. Augustine. If they're actually working on the seawall right now this year, but you can pretty much bet if there's any tropical storm or like hurricane winds stuff that's coming through, that downtown area, historic district, it floods. They know it, they're prepared for it. But guess what they're showing on the news? That's what they're showing on the news is all that water. If you're thinking about moving here, the areas that you're probably most interested in are these newer communities or the master plan communities. They're not building those in flood zones. And we're going to go into that a little bit deeper. And then I will note somebody made a good point, and they were talking about I would rather go through hurricane season than deal with the tornado. And isn't that the truth? They're like, at least we know if a hurricane is coming. With the tornado, there's most times there's little to no warning. It's just bam, it's there. And I can talk about that from experience. I've had 2 family members whose homes were completely demolished. They had to rebuild from scratch. Hurricanes, you're prepared. So our hurricane season, the Atlantic hurricane season anyway, runs from June 1st through November 30th. Okay, so it is essentially hurricane season right now. Now for 2026, here's what forecasters have kind of called for this season. They're calling for it to be like a 30-year average. So roughly like 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and three major hurricanes. They're calling for a category 3 or higher. Does that mean that they're all going to hit here in Northeast Florida? No. So luckily, if you're looking at a map, maybe I'll show the state of Florida here on the side. We are so lucky that we kind of, like if a hurricane typically comes, like it just scoots like right up, like it just kind of doesn't go in and it just completely misses us. And I'm so lucky, fingers crossed, that that's always the case. You should have preparations, flashlights, batteries. Most people have, a generator just in case, because just because we don't have major destruction doesn't mean wherever you're living, you may not have a power outage. This was my first year living here. Was it Hurricane Michael maybe? And then came through, and I think we were without power in my neighborhood for like 3 days. It was horrible. But after that, we got a generator hooked up, installed with the house, and never had to use it. So, but it's better to be prepared than not. And our hurricane season is the same thing that you can think of as far as like how the Midwest prepares for storms or how California plans for wildfires. It's all just part of that nature and preparation. Now, like I said, when you are thinking about moving here, most of the master plan communities are not in a like flood zone where you're required to carry flood insurance. Most of them are what's called flood zone X. And again, you're not required to carry flood insurance. It's not mandatory, but you always want to check the address. And I have links for all of that. And we can check the address to see where it falls on that flood zone map. Because if you're in any other flood zone, then you will be required to carry flood insurance. And we'll go over kind of like what that may look like as far as price wise. Now, I kind of did some research on what the premiums were looking like for St. Johns County as far as insurance. And from what I saw, the premiums for insurance, homeowners insurance, ran from anywhere from like 2,000, maybe all the way up to 3,000. And that was the average. Of course, that's going to vary depending on where your house is located, but that's about the average. Now, if you're looking down at like Naples, Fort Myers, those areas, you're looking at 4,000, 8,000 in those ranges. And then I did want to note that in 2026, so just this year, we had a tort reform legislation here in Florida that cracks down on frivolous roof claim lawsuits and assignment of benefits abuse. So since then, several carriers have filed anywhere from like 5 to 10% rate cuts, which has been great. I know we had some insurers who just like completely left the state, some who just their prices were just astronomical. So we've all seen a little bit of the price drops there. And new insurers are starting to re-enter the Florida market. We just had such abuse on those roof claims. So that's not a dramatic drop. Rebuild costs are still climbing with cost of goods, but the trend, it seems like, is moving in the right direction for the first time in years. So here in Florida, you just have your regular homeowners insurance. And then if you need a flood insurance policy, it is a separate policy. So note that. So, and then, like I said, it's Zone X. That doesn't mean zero risk, but it means lower cost. So like if you wanted to carry flood insurance just to be on the safe side, that is going to be considerably lower to carry that flood insurance being in a low zone compared to a high risk zone. And I would say if you did carry that flood insurance, maybe you're looking at on average, maybe $400 to $900. Don't quote me on that, but that's about the average. Now, what are your home insurance premiums? What are those based on? So it's based on wind and hurricane exposure, your roof age and condition, wind mitigation features like impact windows, usually what's that's based on. So depending on the carrier, homes that are 20 years or older typically have to have a 4-point and a wind MIT. And so that's how they're going to calculate your insurance rate. The 4-point goes over your roof, electrical, plumbing, and HVAC. And then, of course, your wind mitigation. And those, again, depending on the carrier, but it's typically homes that are 20 years old or older that require those. It's a little bit frustrating when I see posts about Florida online and people try to group and talk about Florida as a whole, but our weather varies so greatly depending on where we are in the state of Florida, so you really can't group things together. I mean, it's just different. And Northeast, like I said, Northeast Florida area is going to be dramatically different from Southwest Florida and South Florida as far as your insurance premiums, flood insurance, all of those things. And of course, if you're thinking about a move here, I mean, you're going to need to factor in those costs. And then, of course, if you're moving into like an HOA or a community that has CDD fee, those are things too that you'll want to consider. And then, of course, property tax bill. Can't leave that out. That's a biggie. We won't even go to property tax bill because I'm sure you've seen on the news potential changes. That's a whole nother video. But I hope you found this video helpful and it kind of summed up, answered any questions that you have. If you have any other specific questions, I'm going to put my contact information right here. As always, you can find it down in the description of this video. You can call, text, email. I'd be happy to help you and answer any questions that you have and about your potential move here to Northeast Florida, St. Johns County area. And as always, until next time.